I've been looking forward to this conversation for weeks now, and I'm glad to finally be in conversation with these amazing women, which I have to actually say is a rarity, as you know, not only in investigative news, but in covering technology. And we'll be talking about that throughout this conversation. But first, let me introduce them to you. To my right, I have Shira Frankel. She covers cybersecurity for the New York Times in San Francisco. Shira was part of the Times team that won a George Polk Award for a series of investigative reports on how tech companies, including Facebook, deceive the public while maximizing profits. Next to Shira, we have Carroll Caldwalder. She's a journalist for The Guardian and The Observer in the United Kingdom. She worked for a year with whistleblower Christopher Wiley to publish her investigation into Cambridge Analytica, which she shared with the New York Times. This investigation resulted in Mark Zuckerberg being called before Congress and Facebook losing more than $100 billion from its share price. Caldwalder has also won a Polk Award and the Orwell Prize for Political Journalism, and she was named a Pulitzer Prize finalist for national reporting in 2019. Yes, for both Shira and Carroll, yes. And finally, we have Christina Passerelle. She is the technology editor for The Washington Post. She oversees tech coverage with a team of reporters from Washington, New York, and San Francisco. And Christina previously worked at the Wall Street Journal for nearly 14 years, and recently as deputy technology editor in its San Francisco bureau. There, she helped guide some of the biggest technology stories of the year, including Russia's use of US social media platforms before and after the 2016 election. So as you can see, we're going to have a really interested and spirited discussion. So I'd like to start off this discussion. I want to turn this towards you guys. But I'd like to start off this discussion by talking. Oh, they were actually going to get up and try to move it for me. Yeah, I'll turn the mic a little bit. Well, no, it's kind of static. It's okay. It's all right. Yeah, I'm hooked up. So I wanted to talk about this moment in time and how all three of you all have been at the heart with what is now becoming a norm in tech reporting, and that's taking a critical look at technology and tech companies. And I think that it's also important that we talk about how you got here, because in many ways, all of you were very much established journalists, but also outsiders when it comes to covering big tech. And so I'd like to first talk with you, Shira. It's important to pack this because for so long, tech reporting has been about the latest gadgets, the Apple iPhones, company growth, and that involved lots of cozy relationships with longtime tech journalists, many of whom were male. So Shira, you have a long history as a reporter. How did you get to this point of covering technology in this way?
Well, I really enjoyed the last panel because actually I was a Middle East correspondent for 10 years before I moved here and started covering technology. And a lot of my approach to journalism, my approach to reporting in general is based on the 10 years I spent as a foreign correspondent living in the Middle East, which is always coming at the story as an outsider, always looking at a system and saying, right, well, the king is not going to speak to me, the autocratic leader is not going to speak to me, who are the outsiders, who are the dissidents, who are the people on the fringes that I can learn from and understand this story through. And yes, moving to San Francisco and covering, I think my first beat was technically described as cyber warfare, was a huge change after a decade in the Middle East, but in some ways it wasn't, because I looked at these companies as being siloed off in the same way that I had seen some governments in the Middle East siloed off. And it was very driven by access. It was very driven by reporters that they had had relationships with for years and who they would invite in and who loved brand new phones and fancy cameras. And I mean, I think I still have an iPhone 6. I'm not a techie. Like, I refuse to have anything smart in my house. Not because I think it's inherently all evil, but just because I'm one of these people that doesn't trust things that I can't fully understand. And so I remember my first week on the job, one of my colleagues had brought in this drone that could attach to a bracelet and would like follow you around and film you. And he was just like super excited. He was like, we can go rock climbing. And I looked at him and I was just like, ISIS is going to use that within the year. Like that's where my brain immediately went there. My brain was just like, this is where this gets used in a horrible way. And I guess that's the bottom line is like my brain immediately goes to how does something get misused? Who are the groups of, who are the minorities? Who are the groups that are going to be badly affected by this? Because that's, as a journalist, like what I want to tell. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a place in journalism for people that review phones, and Lord knows I read those reviews, but it's not my story to tell. My story to tell is like how does technology potentially create harm? What are the problems inherent in society that are created by some of these technology platforms? And when I started reporting on that, I found that there was suddenly a wealth of people that wanted to talk about exactly that.
Mm-hmm. That distinction is very important because those who are inside tech, the inside tech news reporters, they're still very much needed to talk about the gadgets inside technology. But that thirst and yearning, I guess you could think of it as we're now in the adolescence into teenage years and thinking about and taking a critical look at how technology is impacting our lives. Carroll, I'd like to ask the same question for you, and you were a freelance journalist, so this is a very interesting look at being able to step inside of this world and take a deep look at Cambridge Analytica specifically.
So I think I started, my background is that I was a tech utopian. So I just kind of discovered the amazingness of technology and what it could do. I went to a TED conference in 2005. And I had that moment of hearing Jimmy Wales talk about Wikipedia and the way the crowd was going to come together and it was going to cure cancer and it was going to be amazing and we were going to live in peace and joy and like a Coke advert forever. And so from that point on, I started writing about technology actually, but from very much the point of being a lay person and for a lay audience, for a sort of features point of view. And then I've had this very slow journey, which has, took me over to the dark side, essentially. And I was already on that curve, I have to say, from quite a few years before the 2016. But then it was like a week before Trump's election that I just had this sort of light bulb moment of seeing the way that Hillary's emails were being weaponized. And thinking, well, politics just can't work in the same way that it did before. This technology is changing everything. And so I just wrote a little op-ed piece a couple of weeks before the US presidential election. And then we had that result, and suddenly fake news became this term. Mark Zuckerberg saying it was preposterous, the idea that Facebook had played any role in this election. And that was when I started looking. They asked me to write an article about this. And my kind of moments of falling down the wormhole, which I like repeating because it was so shocking to me at the time. I still think it's shocking now, was I started, the onus was on Facebook, but for a particular reason I got interested in Google search. And I was like, how does Google search work? Mm-hmm. And so I started putting some words into the search bar. And I put Jews into Google search. Mm-hmm. And then I did the thing which you do, is you make it into a question. So I put, are Jews? Mm-hmm. And Google suggested to me, are Jews evil? And that was its top suggestion. You didn't even have to press return to get the page of results. And the page of results said, yes, Jews are evil. And it gave me 10 websites which said that Jews are evil. And then the next suggestion down the bottom, it gives you another suggestion. And the next suggestion was, did the Holocaust happen? So I clicked on that, and I got a page of results saying, no, the Holocaust didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And the top website was Stormfront, which was a Nazi website. And so I wrote my first article on this kind of days later. And I mean, just the sort of shock and horror and disbelief and, this sense of like, how long has this been out here? How long has this been out here? Who's seen this? What has happened to the internet? How many people have been infected by this? That kind of alarm has stayed with me, actually, over the last 2.5 years, and it's sort of propelled this whole thing.
The same for you, Christina, and I know a little bit about your background in that you were very much rooted in business reporting with the Wall Street Journal prior to the Washington Post. Now you're leading an ever-growing team of folks that are planted here in the Silicon Valley. How did you get here?
So I also was a foreign correspondent for many years. I was abroad for 15 years before coming back to the US 4 years ago for the JSK Fellowship, which you did as well. I was in the very hardship post of Paris for a long time. But you know, when I ran our European fashion and luxury coverage for the Wall Street Journal, which again was another true, you know, hard beat. But actually, all joking aside, I mean, I would do everything from covering the runways and going to the fashion shows to, we had this, you know, garment factory collapse in Bangladesh in 2013, April, actually, it was almost exactly 6 years ago right now. And it was the largest industrial accident anywhere in the world in 30 years. And, you know, 1,300 people died. And I did a year of reporting on the Bangladeshi garment industry after that. So it was truly the high and low and the glitz as well as the dark side that is actually the same kind of thing we see in technology. So, and after I came out here for our fellowship, I just decided I was kind of ready to stay out here again. I went to Berkeley a long time ago. So I stayed with the Wall Street Journal and became deputy technology editor. And, you know, I never would have thought 10 or 15 years ago that I would have had anything to do with technology, because I also am not I'm not a tech person. I felt like I did not really get science very well in school. And so like my idea of technology and what was relevant about technology was very much like rooted in the, you know, early 2000s. But by the time I came back out here, I mean, technology is everything. Technology is in everything that we do. It's changing our world incredibly fast. And that's actually what I love about the story. And that was kind of how I, you know, felt like this was really the right thing for me to be doing in journalism.
Yeah. The title of this panel is Code of Secrecy. And so I'd like to start this leg of the conversation in talking about the levers that you can push in covering technology in the Silicon Valley and beyond. Shira, in your explosive piece, Delay, Deny, and Deflect, How Facebook Leaders Fought Through Crisis, you and your colleagues interviewed more than 50 people for your piece. I want to say when we talk about the levers, meaning because this is private industry, you can't really put in requests for FOIA requests, or some of the other things that we can do with regulated industries. I'd love for you to talk about that feat and having a collection of those sources that are deeply knowledgeable within the company of Facebook, the time and the responses and the depths of interviews that you got.
So we started work, myself and Cecilia King started work on this story roughly 7 months before it was published, and then later on our colleagues, Nick Confessori, Matt Rosenberg, and Jack Nickus were separately working on a story that was more Washington focused, and so roughly 4 months later, our stories ended up kind of converging. But what I'll say about the sources, the more than 50 I think we ended up citing, that was people whose information went into the story. We had a whole debate about this, like how many people should we put down, but at one point Cecilia and I were saying, well, if you want every single person at Facebook we asked a question of or made a phone call to, you'd have to say hundreds, because that's what it took over the course of 7 months to get this story accomplished. I had always known going into the Times and into covering Facebook that I wanted to know what they knew about Russia and when. And it drove me crazy that we were 2 years after the elections and we still didn't have that sense of what the company knew. And I was like, look, someone at that company knows what happened and they're gonna tell me. And I've just gotta approach the story like that. I didn't have a lot of sources at Facebook because I hadn't really covered them as a company, but there's a Starbucks right around the corner. And I had a newborn daughter at home who was very mobile, thankfully, and I would just go. Honestly, I would sit there with her days and people would talk to me, and I would give out my business card. And yeah, out of like 20 or 30 people, one person would email me or call me, but that's what it takes sometimes. It's that one person that actually says, hey, I want to talk to this crazy lady at Starbucks.
With the newborn baby, what an extra little asset there.
I know,
Yeah.
she's super cute. That definitely helped. But no, I mean, it was partially that. It was also, I will say, it's not like I had no sources. I knew some people at the company that had talked to me over the years that I could go back to, but they were more to check what I'd already heard. What I discovered was that someone would tell me something really simple, like, well, there was this board meeting that happened at one point in the fall, and that was really explosive. And I'm like, okay, so it's in the fall and it's a board meeting. And I know it's a board meeting, so Sheryl Sandberg's gonna be there, Mark Zuckerberg's gonna be there. Who else would know about their board? So you work backwards. And I remember we had weekly meetings on this, and every week I'd be like, okay, well now I know that it happened between the months of, July and December, and now I know that it happened in this room in the building, and now I know this one thing one person said. And we held ourselves to a really high bar with this because we wanted only people that had been physically in the room or had, we wanted first-hand sources. We wanted 3 of them because we knew they weren't going to be named. And we knew that Facebook was going to push back on anything we reported. So when we finally did go to Facebook, we could say, guys, we've got 3 sources or 7 sources or 8 sources that have told us that in this meeting, this thing was said. And if you want to refute it, you can refute it, but you're refuting 8 separate accounts that said that this thing happened. And that was really, I think, how we got the story done. We knew with a company like Facebook that is very protective of their image, we had to have that level of certainty that we knew what we were writing was absolutely true.
When you were finally able to talk to Facebook, you mentioned that you had these no-surprise conversations with them. How does that process help or hinder, in many ways, you laying out for them, this is what we found, and based on what we found, and we have all these sources, is this true or not?
We went through a meticulous process. I had typed out every single fact that was in the story ahead of time, and I went through it one by one with them. And they knew, I think it was roughly 2 weeks before the story was published, I'd gone through them and I said, we're gonna say this, we're gonna say this, we're gonna say Sheryl said this, and Mark said that. And we laid it all out, and I think that's an incredibly important process, especially when you're doing investigative journalism, because what if you got it wrong? What if 3 different people, you hope 3 different people aren't going to tell you the wrong version of something. But I've heard horror stories from journalists that had exactly that happen to them. And so if something is categorically wrong, you have to find that out, and you have to give them a chance to push back. We actually, to our surprise, they did not push back during those calls. There were minor details. For instance, at one point, there was a debate over whether Sheryl had yelled or raised her voice. That was something that came up. They wanted us to say that she had raised her voice rather than yelling, and I said, listen, 3 separate accounts all use the word yelling. That's just the word we're going with here. But I will say that they didn't dispute any of the facts of the story, and that's part of what was really surprising to me when in the days after the story was published, they came out with a blog post calling us, well, actually in the blog post they didn't call us fake news, but in an all-hands meeting that they held at the company, they called us fake news, which I thought was, yeah, well.
And there was something else that happened at that meeting, right? They were talking about anyone else who wants to talk with reporters, that there would be repercussions. How has that impacted your ability to continue coverage?
Well, they actually assigned one of their lawyers to go on a hunt for our sources. He spent roughly 2 months looking for them. I'm thankful to say that not a single source has had any problems. They very, clearly at that meeting and at a follow-up meeting said, anybody that talks to the New York Times, really any news organization will be fired. It's in a violation of your contracts, of your NDAs. I would say that the people who wanted to speak to us, it infuriated them, and we had a torrent of calls from people. It never ceases to, I always wonder what these companies are thinking, because in my experience, every time a CEO stands in front of a group of people and says, don't do this, you're gonna have a lot of people in the room that go, well, screw you. I actually think that story was right. I was in that meeting, so-and-so yelled, and so said this, and this was right. And yes, there are some people at Facebook that were happy to hear their CEOs defend the company, but there were a lot more that reached out to me for the first time. And my information is very public on Twitter and whatnot. And so we had, Cecilia and I did a count at one point, I would say 60 or 70 people reach out to us in the 2 weeks following the story to say, you guys got it right, and it's the tip of the iceberg, and there's more, and let's talk, let's meet, let's have coffee. So clearly telling people not to talk to journalists is not the way to do it, no.
Yeah. Carroll, you worked with a whistleblower for quite a bit of time and built a relationship. And we're talking about these subversive ways that you can be able to find ways to get at the story and use your sourcing to get at that. Chat with us for a little bit about that.
So one of the things that I've discovered is that facts are not enough in the age and the times that we're living in. And actually, I feel that sort of straight journalism isn't quite enough because the companies can just ignore it. And so that's the process I've been on is like, it's not enough just to find the facts and to find what goes on, and even then to publish it. You then have to find more creative ways, actually, of trying to sort of tell the story and to make it connect with people. So, for example, the very first piece that I did in this space around the Google searches, I was so shocked and appalled, and I wrote the thing in a rage, and I put it out there, and I was like, aha, Google, okay, now, you know, tell us what's going on, tell us how you're going to fix this. And I just got a completely blank wall from Google. They wouldn't even give me a proper comment for publication. They denied there was a problem. They started behind the scenes going around and hand editing results. And there was a kind of flurry of you know, the article went viral and there was this sort of flurry of attention. But then, and I was supposed to sort of, you know, normally I'd go on to the next story. And I was like, well, no, hang on a minute. This is like, they're spreading Holocaust denial. And they're just going to get away with it. And they're kind of denying there's a problem here. So I just thought, okay, well, I've just got to kind of carry on. So the next week I wrote an op-ed about, so are we okay with that, with these results of like the Holocaust didn't happen and Stormfront's still at the top? We're okay with that, are we? And then the next week what I did was I took out I got an AdWords, a Google AdWords account. I thought, aha. And I placed my own advertisement at the top of the results saying, yes, the Holocaust did happen. They really hated that. And, and then they were getting increasingly annoyed with me. They were ringing up my editor and they were saying, this isn't on, she hasn't given us enough time, blah, blah, blah. And then what they did on Christmas Eve, we then got a legal threat from them. So it's like the one day of the year that the editors are all off because we don't have a paper on Christmas Day, and that was the day all of my senior editors were sent this big legal complaint. So it's just been this, and that's kind of classic. And so with the Cambridge Analytica story, it was exactly the same thing. This wasn't a new story. Harry Davies, who is a freelance journalist for The Guardian, he was the one who got the original story, December 2015. He found out about the harvesting of the Facebook data. He got it past our lawyers. He published that, and Facebook just didn't respond. They just ignored it. And so then in just exactly the same time that I wrote that Google piece, Hannes Grassedger, a journalist in Switzerland, he wrote the first sort of Cambridge Analytica piece for a Swiss magazine in December 2016. And again, they just ignored it. I wrote the first piece about Cambridge Analytica February 2017. Again, they just ignored it, couldn't even get a comment out of them. The Intercept wrote about it. So it was sort of, the facts are out there, but it's not connecting, it's not getting the traction, and they're just able to ignore it. And so that's when this is when I kind of like, okay, I've got to find somebody, and that's when I started doing this tracking down. But it's particular things which made me go, right, okay, and so I went and started tracking down ex-employees. And then when I found Chris, and I had this first, he was in Canada at the time, I had this first insane, like 7-hour telephone conversation with him.
How many hours?
Like 7 hours. It was like insane. And he was like, yeah, I've got the documents, I've got the receipts. And yeah, Steve Bannon told me, you know, it was kind of like, what? And I was just like, this is amazing. He's so articulate. He's an eyewitness. It's this first-hand account. And so initially I used him as an anonymous source. And again, it was, I spent months, it was like a really long extended period of figuring out how I could do this as a news story. And it was kind of impossible. The story is so crazy. Like going into my news editor and going, Well, so it involves Steve Bannon and the President of the United States, but also like half the British establishment who are on the board of this company. But there's also these weird... so it was kind of like also as well like figuring out how to tell the story was a really big part of it. But then when there was the possibility, and we started talking to Chris about him coming forward as an individual, a person, I just knew that this... I just knew that this would be... It would take it to such a different level if people heard directly from a person who was able to talk so articulately firsthand at what he'd seen. And so it was just that thing that I just knew that was going to be really powerful. And so that's why I worked for a year, kind of day and night, to make that possible, really.
I want to talk with both of you all about developing those relationships. But I want to ask you, Christina, about, as someone who is the editor and oversees folks who have deep knowledge and have been covering this particular beat for many years, and then those who are very new to it, I'd love to know the process for you in really trusting the sources and also trusting your reporters and what they're telling you with anonymous sources.
I mean, I think that, you know, for anybody in journalism, the relationship between editor and reporter is so important. I mean, I know my reporters really, really well. I trust them and they trust me, which means that then when we can debate about a source's motivations, it's done with that foundation of trust. I'm not questioning them. I'm not skeptical of them. I am helping them to achieve their goal of getting a great story out.
Yes.
So,
I thought there was something interesting you said, Shira, before about, you know, we navigate as journalists with the intense thirst for wanting to know what's happening day to day with the tech industry and Facebook in particular and Amazon and Google, and then the long game and being able to provide these deep analysis and investigations. And you called your relationship something really interesting, like someone told you in the past the difference between a one-night stand or a long-term relationship. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I actually say this often to students when I'm journalism students and young journalists, and the analogy I always use is that there are people that are dating to marry, and then there are people that are dating to get laid. And the same goes for journalists. I sometimes use a more vulgar term depending on whether we've had beers that night or not. But there are journalists that are out there and they're looking to marry. And if you want to get into investigative journalism, that's the lane you want to be in. You are meeting sources for the first time, and they're probably scared. They might be afraid of losing their life, and as was my experience in the Middle East, they might be afraid of losing their jobs, as was the case of many people at Facebook. Your job is to develop a real relationship with them, and so you don't show up on the first date and say like, "Hey, spill the goods, like, you know, give me the documents, let me see your email." It's not how you develop a trusting relationship. You let them get to know you, and you get to know them, and you show them step by step that you can be trusted. And I have sources now that I've spoken to for 15 years that I still regularly go back to, and they know when they come to me with something, they're going to be fine. And I'm not trying. There are very good journalists out there that do get really quick one-off scoops from sources, and there's a whole industry of journalism for those like fast one-off scoops. But in my experience, those aren't going to lead to those like really amazing, thorough stories with fully fleshed out reporting and colorful figures, and you'll know what the person in the room was wearing and which part of the building they were sitting in. Like that just takes time. So yeah, I mean, depending what kind of journalism you do, you want to know how to approach your source.
This question really is for all of you. How do you navigate the yearning for the incremental scoops versus the big stories? I mean, everyone is now interested and focused on tech. Christina, you all are building out your bureau. Every day you're hiring more and more people. With that means that there are more people on the ground. But how do you navigate being able to satiate the intense yearning for the daily information as well as the long game?
I kind of like almost shouldn't let my reporters know this, but but I think that even with so we're, yes, in the process of, near the end of doubling the size of our tech team. So there's going to be, last fall we announced that we were creating 11 new positions based between Washington, mostly in San Francisco, and then our first Seattle-based correspondent. And I'm very close to having hired the last of those 11. That doesn't actually mean, like, my goal is not actually to put out more stories every day. Like, the things that we produce should have really large impact. So it's not a volume game. It's quality, not quantity. So I would rather that, we hold things back a little bit. I don't tend to, like, pressure my reporters very much to, like, churn out more and more stories. I want to talk with them about, like, what are the big issues, what are they focused on, what do they want to accomplish this year, what are the big issues that we should be looking at going into the 2020 election. That's really where we kind of try to keep our focus. I mean, of course, there's always, like, then whatever, they get some, like, good scoop and they hear footsteps on it, and, like, we'll put out stories, sometimes pretty quickly too. Yeah. But we're focused on more that longer term target.
Let's talk a little bit. Did you want to
speak
on
that? Yeah, well, actually, it's really curious, actually, because with being from Britain with American tech journalists, because we do come from a different space, and we are not able to. The New York Times gets different responses from Facebook that we do, because Facebook pays more account to you and to your lawmakers than it does to us. And this was, like, a really important part of it, is that the sort of ignoring and denials, they treat the rest of the world, the rest of the world is, like, literally labelled the rest of the world to Facebook. and they really don't give a shit about us. I mean, it really feels like that. This thing, the utter contempt that they've shown to the British Parliament in refusing to come and give evidence. And, we're in the Anglophile world. We've had this special relationship with America. Forget it if you're from Sri Lanka or Myanmar. Like, what hope have they got? And so I think there is this real special responsibility which goes with American journalism in this space. It is kind of on you. And it was one of the key things in terms of when we were thinking about the impact and, like, how to make these facts meaningful and how to make them have traction was a really large part of this story. And so actually partnering with an American news organisation was really key. And I think in this sort of new world that we're in, that these collaborations are, as difficult as they are, which they are really important. And also, I think that's where having a focus in reporting tech that does go, that actually maybe it is more that sort of reaching out to tech journalists in other countries or something, I don't know, but it's a, Facebook will pick up the phone to you. Facebook will ish.
Sometimes, yeah, she says.
I was with my colleagues from the West Coast office of The Guardian last night, and we still don't get interviews at all. And I actually don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think access journalism is one of the reasons that kind of we got into the state that we're in.
Yeah. I'll just say that I think some journalists at the New York Times might get their phone calls. It's gotten better, and I do think that I will say that I've found that my experience with not just Facebook, but every tech company is that you force them to pick up the phone. When I write them an email and I'm like, I'm kind of interested in what you're going to do about the elections in India, like, that's not going to. But if I say, I found out that 2 of the fact partnering organizations you have in India are going to quit on you and you're going to run out of fact checkers, and I'm writing a story tomorrow to say that you don't have enough fact checkers, like, they're on the phone, they're on the phone within an hour. So I think that's for us been a big part of it, is coming to them and saying, like, this is what we're going to say, and you have a certain amount of time to respond. one of the things I was just going to comment on in terms of I do think we have a great responsibility, those of us that are based here in the United States and especially in Silicon Valley, in asking questions of what these tech companies are doing in the rest of the world. The last 3 stories I've written for the New York Times were about the elections in Ukraine, the elections in India, and one we have coming up in Europe. So we actually spend a lot of time, and I've written extensively about what happened with Facebook in Myanmar, because I know that I can force answers and I can spend time interviewing Facebook employees who were involved in content moderation decisions in Myanmar, where journalists in Myanmar don't have that, they don't know who works at Facebook, probably, right? They don't have that time to go sit at the Starbucks or do whatever, you know. So I need to be doing that for them, because what happened in their country was egregious. And what, you know, the responsibility of tech companies to acknowledge what happened and the mistakes made needs to happen from those of us that are here and can press for those answers.
Well, I want to ask you, I'm sorry, were you going to respond to her?
Well, I was just going to say, the other thing about it is they have an ability to push back harder on us as well, because that's what we, you know, the thing which, I mean, they've talked a bit about it, but the fact of Facebook sending us a pre-action legal letter the day before publishing the Cambridge Analytica stuff, they didn't send it to the New York Times. I mean, it was really shocking, I think.
Can we go this thing back just a little bit, just so they'll get, I know that a lot of people know about the Cambridge Analytica story and that you all partnered with the New York Times, and that it also was published in The Intercept. But I want, before you get to the legal action, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about even the challenges of getting that to happen, and then you can talk a little bit about the legal action that happened against you all, but then not against the New York Times.
Well, part of it was, I mean, it was such a difficult year. So when I published the first story, which featured Chris Wiley as an anonymous source, it was an article May 2017 called The Great Brexit Robbery. And it really kind of, it was a narrative piece which sort of put the sort of technology and the data in context with what happened with Trump and Brexit and these weird links through to Russia. And then a week later, or days later, we had the first legal threat from Cambridge Analytica. And we're in a really different sort of environment in Britain. Our defamation laws are weaponized by companies. And so it's even if you can't win, it's a way of suppressing journalism, and that's the way that they are used. And so when we had the first legal threat, so it's like Cambridge Analytica, they're owned by a billionaire who's ideologically motivated, has incredibly deep pockets, Trump bankrolled Trump, and he's threatening to sue us. He's threatening to sue The Guardian, he's threatening to sue me as an individual, and he's threatening to sue us not just in Britain, but in America too, and not just for damages, which is in the millions, but special damages, which is multi-millions. And, you know, this was really early on in the Trump presidency. We'd seen how Peter Thiel took out Gawker, and I think that was really present in, you know, senior executives' mind as they were like, uh-oh, what's she gone and done? And it, you know, it created these really difficult reporting circumstances for an entire year, and that was the first of the legal letters. The third one we got, which was in the fall of 2017, when all sorts of things were happening at the same time. It was when Mueller unsealed the first indictment with George Papadopoulos, and we saw how the Russian embassy in London was sort of a very key conduit. Theresa May, the Prime Minister, started talking about Russia, and the Russian embassy started writing me letters, calling me a bad journalist. The guys who had employed Cambridge Analytica, this political group in Britain, started putting out these weird tweets and messages and kind of weird threats to me. And then at the same time, so it all happened at once, we got a legal letter from Cambridge Analytica, very, very detailed. And essentially we had a legal meeting at the newspaper, and it was like, this is really serious. If we don't deal with this, you're not going to be publishing anymore, you're going to be buried in litigation, they can issue proceedings at any time. And I was kind of in a bit of a panic. I was like, should I go to the US? What should I, you know, it was, but we spent, you know, we employed external counsel. There was a lawyer who spent at least a week's worth of work on it. I spent a week on it. Christopher Wiley spent a week on it. Our letter back was like 45 pages long. I mean, this was really, really serious. And so initially from the newspaper, Chris very much felt that this needed to connect to an American audience. So for that reason, he said that an American publication was a sort of, he felt that was a really key part of it. And initially, the Guardian and Observer were like, well, no, this is our story. And then actually, they were really good, and they did understand that, it was partly about spreading risk, but also just this strength in numbers. And I mean, it was difficult initially because Chris was like, he was just like, give him your stuff, like, let's just. And I was like, so you want me to give away a year of my work?
It doesn't work like that for you to just give them your work.
I really do believe that he had the bigger picture, and I really believe in it now, which is the strength in collaboration. And this idea of the old-fashioned notion of like we've got our exclusive scoops is old-fashioned, and we need to like think differently in this age. And that the network effects of it just made it a bigger story, and it was really worth doing, I think. And it was all credit to the New York Times for.
I was not, by the way, part of the team that I just want to mention.
I want to talk a little bit about collaborations, but I first want to go back to what you were saying about the letters you were receiving and the vitriol that you received, the pushback you received about your Cambridge Analytica stories. There's also this argument that just took over online that you're working in a news organization, but you're an activist working in a news organization with an agenda versus someone who is a journalist that's uncovering investigations. I'd love to know your response to that, because that has kind of been dogged. I mean, you've received even letters saying that you're not a real journalist.
I think initially there was some nervousness in the news organisation about the idea of being a campaigner. But I think that kind of dissipated quite quickly, actually. And it's sort of like, I'm really happy. I mean, my thing is that I'm campaigning for the truth, it's the truth of just trying to get out the work. So trying to make people take notice of the journalism. And in Britain, so it's wonderful, and it's amazing that you're staffing up and there's all these people now covering the subject. But in Britain, that's just really not the case. This has been such a fringe story. And so this story also connects to these multiple crimes which took place in our referendum. And that's seen as highly political in Britain. And so our press landscape is very, very right-wing, mostly, or not independent. And they just haven't covered the story at all. And there's also been an issue because the BBC dropped various investigations and they haven't covered it. So this sort of agitation that I've had in like using all channels to try and amplify the journalism, and that's really how I hated, before I started this story, I absolutely hated social media, and I still sort of do, but I realised that actually I could use it and sort of drive attention to it on Twitter, and also strike back, because there were some talks yesterday from people saying that don't go out there on Twitter and be very careful, and I found that it's actually been kind of really crucial to go out there and fight
Do you
back.
all feel this way as well about social media in the context of your work? Shira and Christina.
I mean, certainly social media is an important tool for us to get out, to get a broader audience for our stories. Even though, to be honest, it's not as, Google search is way more powerful than Twitter or Facebook now, as well, Google News, and then just our homepage and push alerts. So technology itself is a big tool to get the stories out. But I would say social media itself a little bit less. One of the other things that we see happening that is really worrying is, the attacks. Last year we wrote a whole body of work about the origins of hate online and exploring everything from Parkland to the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, how hate is bred online. And the reality is my reporters are the target of that, increasingly. And it's really worrying. So, social media is as much of a liability, I think, on a personal level for journalists as it is a tool to get out.
How do you handle that? And how do you handle that in protecting your reporters? I mean,
we have like a security team.
You have a security
Yeah.
team? Carroll, you've had threats against your life?
Yeah, we didn't have a security team.
Yeah. Shira.
We do have a security team, and one of the things we did, well, I did this years ago when I was still in the Middle East, because then the threats are very specific and the danger is much more specific, that would dox you online and go through. So we had a person that we hired externally who would go through and say, right, if I was trying to stalk you or figure out where you live or figure out who you're, what restaurants you hang out in, can I find that out by what's already out there? Mm-hmm. And then he would report back and say, well, you actually exposed yourself and you commented on someone else's Twitter that you love that restaurant, or you, your cousin has a Facebook page which is open to the public where she tags you in photos all the time. And so if someone wanted to figure out where you live, they can find it out through her Facebook page. And I think more and more news organizations here in the United States are hiring people that will do exactly that for journalists. I have a love-hate relationship with Twitter. I still think it's a great forum for ideas. I think it is important as a journalist to defend myself on Twitter when things are said about my work or my colleagues' work, which are just categorically untrue. That being said, I have seen time and time again how what I think is a very simple defense of a story can turn very quickly, and then you become, I always joke around with my colleagues that the last thing I want to do is go viral on Twitter. That's a nightmare day when a tweet goes viral. And so I've just learned to be very measured about it and to have a thick skin, especially, I know we're going to talk about this at one point, but especially being a woman on Twitter. There's just a certain level of vitriol that's reserved for women on Twitter, females with voices on Twitter, I should say. And maybe it was the decade I spent in the Middle East or the inordinate amount of penises that have been sent to me unsolicited. But I've just learned to say, this is trash, and these people are, actually the few people I've written back to, I've said things like, what you said is really crass and vulgar, and I don't know what happened to you in your life to make you speak to a woman this way, but I'm sorry that something that bad happened to you that you felt the need to send a pornographic image to a woman you've never met before.
Yeah. You respond.
I sometimes respond. If I'm in a mood for it, I'll respond. And it's amazing how many times, most of the time they don't write anything back, but 3 different times they've written me back and been like, oh, sorry. And I'm like, what? That's what it took, But most of the time I don't respond because I would be a crazy person if I responded. I would not be able to live my life or report if I responded to everything horrible that was said on Twitter.
But weirdly, I feel it's kind of part of the... Weirdly, I find some part of it is also part of the story, after all, because you're also writing about this dysfunction of these technology platforms. And one of the things I've found is that basically being a reporter, you're just a bit further ahead than the rest of the population in that sense that you become an object of really targeted propaganda. And so you experience what that propaganda is like on a personal level. And for example, when I had this horrible death threaty video put out on Twitter, and you realise in this very personal way, oh, okay, this isn't public space because you can't get this video down.
Yeah.
It's a private company, and we should all be, the way that I'm experiencing this, and the sense of threat that I feel about it, and unease we should all be feeling, because this is a private company which is beyond the bound of our national laws. And if that, it's that really basic thing when you think about it. If that had been put outside my house, I could have called the police and they would have taken it down and they might have arrested somebody. Whereas it was just somehow, not only that it was impossible to do anything about, but it was also kind of normalised and acceptable. And I think that's one of the, the things that we really need to sort of fight against, I think.
Let's talk a little bit about accuracy. So former Chief Security Officer for Facebook, Alex Stamos, has written pretty extensively on Twitter and said on different panels that part of the reason why Facebook does not fight back against things that are written this is an interesting way of looking at it, but part of the reason why they've not fought back against some of the things that were written because they knew that the details weren't true or didn't line up, especially on the technical side of things. So those who work in Silicon Valley, for instance, will say, like, on the larger scheme of things, this story is probably bogus or not true because there are these technical things that are talked about the technology that don't line up with how we work and operate. I'd love to know your responses to that. Christina.
Well, I mean, as Carroll was saying, like, we're all in pursuit of the truth. So, I mean, I think that, writing about the actual technology is tricky because it's highly technical. We know that even many people in the companies themselves don't understand the technology.
It's like the term data breach and how we're told it's not a data breach.
Right.
And that distinction was something that was a big deal.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit almost like just the definition. Like, is a data breach. I know that, like, Facebook has a very specific definition of what a data breach is. And, something like, your data being used improperly is not a data breach because somebody didn't come in and, like, pierce their systems. They just took it like they were just like an app that took your data and, like, used it in a bad way. Like, to the end user, to us as consumers of technology, I'm not actually sure that distinction is significant. Like, what matters to us is that our data was not used in the way that we were okay with. It's a little bit like, did Cheryl yell or raise her voice? Well, like, I don't know. It's a little bit kind of the same thing. So, I think that on these technical things, it's important for us to convey, like, what the technology is and, like, how it works because it affects our lives in a way that is going to be understandable to our audience, and we have a very general audience. I don't know.
It's always fun when they get on the phone with you and they're like, so I know you use this, like, one sentence to describe it, but actually you need 3 paragraphs. And you're just like, I'm not going to spend 3 paragraphs getting into the details of where your server was located and which segment of the server. And I mean, I'm sure you've had these conversations with Facebook where they're just like, actually, you need to use this term that no one's ever heard of to describe what happened at this company at this point in time.
Yeah, all of the companies certainly have their technical terms that they like to use. But, like, what do we as the general public understand those things to be? And I think it's really important for us. That's, like, part of our role is to translate these highly technical and complicated things into things that anybody can understand.
Yeah. Carroll, I know there's been a lot of poster reporting, as we mentioned earlier. There was a lot of political theater around the findings of your reporting. And I know you talked a lot about how at the UK, there really has not been a lot of, Facebook has not truly responded in a way that's been significant. But I'd love to know your thoughts as we move forward. How has this changed your relationship with Facebook and your access and your being able to cover them as well as other tech companies, and also with politicians as well?
Well, I love the fact that so after Facebook, refused. So before the story came out, Facebook, like, sent us this big legal threat in the middle of the night. So 1 o'clock in the morning UK time, before the day we were publishing, I get a message from my fellow reporter Emma Graham Harrison, and she's like, Facebook have just put out a press release and they've kicked Cambridge Analytica and Chris Wiley off the platform. And the New York Times want to bring forward publication. And it was this attempt. So the thing that you sort of said, when you put in all the questions, we did go through this very, very formal process. But it also gives the company a chance to respond. And they did that by trying to spoil the story. And it was this very stressful moment where I'm on the telephone to the New York Times assistant editor, go, please don't publish until I can wake a senior editor. And it was kind of crazy, you know, and sort of like desperately waking somebody up on holiday in Spain to like ring the New York Times to say, no, let's hold the deadline, etc. So there was all of that. But we've never had access with Facebook. I mean, that's the... And afterwards, the way they responded, you know, Mark Zuckerberg went on the apology tour. So he went round and gave big interviews to everybody, apart from us. And then they had for the people who didn't get it, they had a group call with the other publications. We weren't on that call. And then they had another call with which was the sort of blogs and things. We weren't even on that call. So it's really, you know...
there's basically...
Yeah. And I suppose to go back to the thing about this, Alex Stamos actually came out and criticised the story on the day of publication. And I responded to it by accusing Alex Stamos of bro-splaining us. Because for a year, I'd been reporting on this story, and some of the strongest pushback I got was from what I called the tech bros, who told me there wasn't a story here, every company did it, it was nothing special, and Cambridge Analytica, there was various people who were going, it's just snake oil. And part of this is that I think that the thing about, yes, of course these people have got amazing, brilliant technical expertise, but that's just one optic of looking at the story. And so we were looking at it from the point of view of being in Britain, where this company had a 30-year history of being a military contractor. So I don't think most campaign data analytics firms had got that, for starter, and we knew that. And, oh God, sorry, I've completely forgotten my second point there. I'm sure it was brilliant.
Which means you'll come back to it.
I will say, like, understanding the technical, I like it when they get on the phone with me and walk through the technicalities of something. It's important to understand that. You need to understand what the difference is between a data breach and a data leak. But at the same time, I think that's also, at times, a very condescending way to relate to reporters and be like, oh, well, you guys don't understand the technology, or you should have used this term and not that term, so now we're going to discount the entire body of your reporting.
How has being, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you know, one of the ironies of that is that we increasingly see that when there's something that goes wrong with the technology, and I'll say, you know, for instance, after the New Zealand attack, when YouTube and Facebook were like, you know, completely overwhelmed with copies of the video all over the place, and they were like, well, the technology is so complicated, and well, we can't control the algorithm. We don't know what the algorithm is doing, and they have to take these kinds of extreme measures to get the genie back in the bottle, but the genie's already out of the bottle. So it's you know, the technology itself is very important, but they themselves have created something that they can't control.
Also, I'm thinking about what we were talking about earlier regarding having access to records, to the written reports within companies. So as reporters, you don't really have that. It's based on what people are telling you. I'm thinking about the difference between covering the aviation industry, for instance, where you can actually read things and go through pages and pages of reports of what went wrong, what went right, and you learn from those things. Shira, you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to say, to me, you know, again, that's why tech reporting and accountable, like tech reporting, which holds companies accountable, is some of the most important reporting we can do today, because these are private companies who operate almost as nation states, their budgets, their influence, and yet we can't FOIA them. We can't demand answers. We don't get to vote on whether, you know, Mark or any member of Facebook's board gets to stay in power. And so all we have is those few people on the inside that are willing to come forth and tell the truth and say, and hopefully show us email and give us documents. And that, I mean, that's the holy grail, is getting a document. But yeah, all we have is those people on the inside whose moral compass has steered them towards a point of view of, actually, I want the truth out there, and it's important for the public to know the truth.
But the other thing is which sort of like joins all these points, actually, is that New Zealand example is really interesting, and it connects to the point which I forgot earlier, which is that this is transnational, and this cannot be, although the United States is very important in this, it's because it affects us all globally, is very key. And so what was so interesting about that New Zealand episode was that I was just kind of furious at my kitchen table because you could see all those videos being uploaded by the second. And we know from the, the literature of contagion how that works and how that will be radicalizing so many people. And you can't put that back in the bottle. That's, that's done there. But we have laws in Britain which it was in breach of.
That's right.
Incitement to violence. And these companies are headquartered in Britain. And I was just sort of furious because, as far as I was concerned, they should just stop the uploads. If you can't control it, then stop the uploads. It's so dangerous. And I was just sort of amazed when our Home Secretary, who's the person who's in control of the police, tweeted something like, "Oh yeah, they really need to do a better job of managing these platforms." It's like, no, it's that it's just so frustrating. Sorry.
And in the UK, you have laws, and of course in Germany, where there are possibly the strictest laws, there is recourse. And we've seen Facebook be more responsive in Germany than we have in any other country because they don't have a choice. They have to take things down within, I think, 24 hours in Germany.
1 in 7 moderators who work on Facebook content, I believe, work on German content because they have to. So this is partly a money problem. It's just partly profit. And so the refusal to kind of have those same stringent safeguards to prevent that kind of the New Zealand thing happening by this company is morally outrageous. And I just feel that we need to be more outraged by what is going on. And that also is the job of journalism, to communicate that. And
we're going to take Q&A, and I just have a feeling folks have lots of questions for you. So prepare to ask those questions. I want to ask you all, as we move forward towards the presidential election, last year this time, exactly last year this time, Mark Zuckerberg was sitting before legislators, and people were talking about the idea of regulation. And it seems that we faded away, and now we're focused, of course, on what's happening with the presidential election moving forward. But as folks who are steeped in reporting on these issues, where do you see this going? Do you see this something that's a prospect on the horizon? Shira?
I've been really focused on the elections that are happening globally this year because I think they're going to be very telling for whether Facebook and other social media companies have actually made changes to their platforms that are going to make a difference in 2020. I would say in terms of regulation, and so far, by the way, the answer is it's better, but the bad actors that are out there are very quickly figuring out ways around the new rules and the new safeguards that Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, et cetera, have put into place. The other thing I would say about regulation is that Facebook is very wisely, I would say, taken the route of, oh, well, if you're going to regulate us, we're going to get on board, but we're going to be really steeped in this process, and we're going to count on Congress being as slow and ineffective and really technologically unsavvy as we possibly can, because we can go there and wow them with science. And I mean, as we saw from those hearings, the questions asked by many, many members of Congress showed a deep sort of ignorance of how these platforms work. And I think Facebook would rather be part of creating regulations they can live with than stand back and see themselves facing regulations in 3 or 4 years that they can't live with.
Questions from the audience. I see several in the back here. We'll start with the gentleman, third row from the back.
Stephen Stock, NBC Bay Area. Thank you so much. This is a very important panel, and congratulations on some superior work. I do have a question, though, and I want to push back a little bit. What Tanya said, I want to compare it to the aviation. Isn't it incumbent on us as journalists to be precise? And I'm thinking a data breach versus a data leak. In aviation, if we report a 737 is in fact a 727, then those in the aviation industry dismiss us because we're not precise and we're not accurate. In this space especially, is it not incumbent on us to get it right? And if we have to explain in a couple of paragraphs in order to relate it to our audience who really doesn't care whether it's a 737 or a 727, it's a big jet. But for those in the industry, if we don't get it right, then they can dismiss us as all fake news.
Shira, you're the one that talked about the paragraphs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a balance, right? Because you, as a reporter, you don't want to, you have to figure out, absolutely get it right. And there's a difference between a data breach and a data leak, and we make sure we understand and use the right terminology. But I do think that there's a difference between saying the data was leaked in that it sat in an open server where anybody could access it. And actually, that's so much worse than the data was breached in that it took action from a malicious actor to get it out of the company and put it out there. So we do want to spend that time and that couple sentences or that paragraph even of explaining it. But I also don't want to spend so much time getting, because I think that too much of the tech reporting has been so steeped in the details, has been so steeped in the language that only a small group of people in Silicon Valley could understand, that they lost the general public in the United States. And I see this constantly with friends and family that live all over the country where they go, well, I send them an article and they go, I just can't understand it. I don't know what that means. And so I'm constantly thinking about, okay, I've got to convey the details in an accurate way that's 100%, accuracies at the top. But I also have to do it in a way that's interesting and direct and concise enough that I keep them interested in reading through the entire story.
I also want to say something, and I want to let you, Carroll, speak too, but it's really interesting when we talk about accountability and these companies and their accountability to making certain that folks get it right. That's just a small distinction for me. I'm thinking about, I actually worked in Seattle for many years and had to interface with Boeing a lot. And how accessible they were to me and to making certain I understood those details. Today, I can call Facebook and call again, send 5, 6, 7 emails, and I might get something back, or I might be directed to a website with their website with one page that details something very simplistically. And I think that's what the majority of journalists might deal with. The Washington Post and the New York Times of the world may have a little bit more access in that vein. I saw there was a question all the way in the back. Can you stand up, sir, just so they can reach you?
Can I just very quickly,
yes,
just very quickly on the data breach thing. So Facebook rang me up and said this is not a data breach, okay? Because we put that in our letter to them. We put down these very precise allegations, and they said, and my colleague said when I got off the phone, she was saying, what are they saying? I said they're very clear it's not a data breach, and she was like, oh, and because we've been thinking about the language, but we then called up our information commissioner. You don't have this position in America who regulates data. And we had a big conference call with, there was like 4 of us our end, there was 4 of us with their general counsel at their end, and we went through the law, and the law is different in Britain. So the thing is that they have now, the thing about data breach was legal liability, and they have been found to be legally liable. And they've been fined the maximum amount in Britain for that. So it was very interesting, that particular battle over data breach, but it has been vindicated.
Yes, sir.
Hello, Malachy Brown, New York Times. What are your thoughts on addressing anonymity on the platforms? And second question, if national governments are ill-equipped to regulate, and it's a transnational problem, do you see any solutions there in terms of an international ombudsman or some sort of clout?
Christina, do you want to take the...
I'm not quite sure I understand the first question about the anonymity on social platforms.
Well, there are many problems, but one of the problems with various different platforms appears to be the ability for anybody to register as John or Jane Doe, and there aren't any easy solutions to that. But as one form of regulation, do you think that is a possible solution for some of the
do away with the anonymity?
Yeah.
It felt like that maybe kind of a year ago that there was quite a bit of talk around Twitter in particular around whether their policy of anonymity, which if we all remember, back to the Arab Spring, was something that they held up as a real attribute because it provided protection for people who would be threatened if their true identity were to be revealed. And now like with many things, unfortunately, in technology, that anonymity has been weaponized. So now it's a cover for attacking people, spreading hate speech and other. I think, I'm not sure that there's really much of a movement going on to try to mandate authenticity. I mean, even on a platform like Facebook, where, as they present it, their whole value is in having people present their real selves, and like you can be kicked off the platform if you don't. But we see all the time, how many fake Mark Zuckerberg profiles are there on Facebook, for instance? And so that's a very hard problem to contain. On the question of regulation, yeah, I mean, we see things, it's so interesting because we actually see things on like a transnational level, and then we see things on like, in the US on a state level. For all of the inaction in Washington around regulation, part of what's interesting is that both parties kind of agree that tech needs to be regulated, but they disagree on what the problems are. And so it seems like we're very far from any kind of regulation in Washington. But of course, here in California, our state government has been, kind of leading the way in terms of passing regulation, and other states are following that now. And then, of course, on a multinational level, we see governments beginning to work together to hold these companies accountable. Both of those, I mean, on the state level, it can be quite complicated for the companies because they can end up with this patchwork of regulation. But it may be that, like with GDPR, which is the European privacy law that came into effect last year, that kind of raised the bar slightly for people worldwide, because it is very hard for these companies to comply with multiple regulations.
We have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am, here.
Hi, I'm Susie Nielsen. I'm a student at the journalism school and work at the IRP. I was curious if any of you or all of you could share your thoughts on what happened at the markup this week. I was really looking forward to the opening of the markup, and I was really disappointed to see what happened. So any insights you have or thoughts would be really appreciated.
I mean, I'm with you. I was also psyched. I think every journalist they hired is a journalist that I would read anything they published in a heartbeat. I don't have any inside information about what happened. I will say that it's been particularly ugly, the way that it's played out in public. The ongoing back and forth and the accusations, I don't know that they serve anybody outside of a very small group of tech reporters in Silicon Valley that are following every incremental, step. It's upsetting because they were a group of journalists that I think could have done something really fantastic, and I hope they figure out a way through this. I hope they figure out a way to produce the kind of journalism we were all hoping they were going to do.
I'm going to pivot slightly off that question to the one from before, which is that I think what has become increasingly obvious is we need new models of journalism. So that was potentially one, but I really keep on banging on about the transnational nature of this. And so what I've been reporting on in Britain is actually kind of a critical piece of the Trump puzzle, because these characters are completely connected. Your voter data in America was processed in Britain. And you kind of need this bit of the story, but there's no body which is reporting transnationally, really, or is looking at the story transnationally. And so that's just I know there's people who fund journalism out here, but it's just something potentially to think about, because, I mean, it's great, actually. I was saying I sort of love the fact that you're staffing up and all the rest of it. But in Britain, our journalism is in my newspaper, which is the Sunday sister of The Guardian. We have like 3 reporters.
Which is why we were so excited about the markup. It's just this idea that the more folks who are on the ground, the more will be revealed. Thank you to all 3 of you for being on this panel.